My name is David Bohl. Thank you for allowing me to share with you today. I'm going to talk about my narrative that I've been working to put together for some time. In other words, I'm going to talk about how do I identify, or I'm going to answer that question, who am I? And of course, my identity is my story. And chronicling this narrative has been a huge part of my recovery and healing, and I hope that you're able to do the same. I would consider myself a relinquishee and an adoptee. I describe myself this way because that's exactly what happened to me. And as Paul Sunderland in his LifeWorks lecture, Adoption and Addiction, Remembered Not Recalled, said, quote, adoption is a word that does not fully describe what has happened to a child. It is a word that works to cover up or deny the wound of relinquishment, a wound that is a developmental post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. There cannot be relinquishment and adoption without trauma. The word adoption also hides another aspect of trauma and relinquishment. Adoption usually only happens once, whereas there may be many relinquishments for the separated child, end quote. Again, Paul Sunderland. His videos are available on YouTube. I also identify as the brother of an adoptee, though my brother does not identify as a relinquishee. As a matter of fact, he doesn't talk much at all about his or my adoptions. And that's his right. I'm not here to judge him or shame him by telling him that he owes it to his children to find a medical history that he can pass along to inform their future choices in healthcare, or that he's still, quote unquote, in the fog meaning that he's in denial or oblivious to the significance of loss inherent in being adopted. I'm not here to tell him or warn him that if he doesn't investigate these origins, that lack of knowing is going to cause him further stress and distress throughout his life. And after all, maybe my brother is simply more able to assimilate that ambivalence or uncertainty inherent in being separated from family origin into his life, or maybe he can endure chronic developmental interruptions. Some might call these stresses or traumas. Maybe he can do that less painfully than I did or other adoptees do. Or maybe that ambivalence just isn't uncomfortable to him or in an overwhelming way as it was to me and many of us. Or maybe, just maybe, while others separated from family of origin remain unsettled and disconnected by this disequilibrium and strive to use conflicting emotions as motivation to search for genetic family and work to determine whether separation might be having a lasting effect on them, their perceptions and their actions, maybe my brother is simply able to say, it is what it is, and I am who I am, and I'm not affected by it. Maybe, but that's not me. Anyway, I'm one of three children in the family that adopted me. I was the first. My sister came 2 years later and was dubbed the miracle baby because she was born to my adoptive parents, a couple who was diagnosed as being infirm. Well, my adoptive dad was anyway. I later learned that after he passed, my adoptive mom told me that he was never the same after hearing that from the doctor. It affected him for the rest of my life. And I'm certainly he didn't have the platform that we do to investigate that grief. Of course, my adopted brother came 5 years after my natural born sister. I further identify as someone who's part of the search community because, like many of you, I've been unofficially searching or wondering from whom I descended from as early in my childhood as I can remember. As a matter of fact, I was convinced at one time that my mother was Norma Jean Mortensen, or as most people know her by her stage name, Marilyn Monroe. But also because I'm formally searching and have been formally searching for some time. First, by adding my name to the national adoption registries, then by obtaining my non-identifying information from the state of Wisconsin, then by petitioning the Wisconsin courts for my original birth certificate, then by hiring a private detective to find family members mentioned after I obtained both my original birth certificate and full adoption file from the state of Wisconsin. All of those ways I've searched. Now, I don't describe myself as being in quote unquote reunion like many do, because by the time I began to formally search, both my bio dad and my bio mom had passed away. My first dad from a brain tumor at age 46, and my first mom as the result of alcoholism. And sadly, there were no parents to quote unquote reunite with. Yet I do identify as someone who's part of the DNA search community. I have, in fact, searched. I have found union. That is, I've located, approached, and I have relationships with two half sisters who descended from my bio mom, a couple of cousins from my mom's side, a half brother and a half sister born to my father, and two aunts and their kids who are sisters of my father. And I continue to try to connect with others, admittedly less desperately today than I did before I knew that any of them ever existed. I will likely be searching for quite some time because I now also identify as being part of the MPE community. MPE is an acronym for Misattributed Per Parentage Event, which is the discovery, usually through DNA testing, that the person one believes to be their biological parent is not biologically related. And this can result from adoption or sperm donation or IVF. It can result from an affair or rape or incest. Yet I'm an MPE, and learning about being an MPE can in itself be a traumatic experience, not the least of which is because it often comes as a surprise, but also it affects identity directly, how we identify. And that's certainly true in my case. As about 18 months ago, I received a message from my half-brother that he'd done some DNA sleuthing and discovered that the man we thought was our grandfather could not be because we didn't share any DNA with him. Wow, that was stunning, but we had to do some more, right? And that caused us to investigate further. So I enlisted the help of DNA Angels, an organization that helps people find biological parents using DNA and research to find out who my genetic grandfather really is. And we did. And this has opened up an entirely new hot mess, if you will, as we felt a responsibility to tell our aunts the truth. And because it isn't easy to decide whether or not I want to plunge into the lives of people related to my genetic grandfather. And sadly, our dad passed away without knowing these truths, probably most importantly. He died not knowing that the man who raised him was not his genetic father. So my bio dad was an MPE, and I'm a grandfather MPE, and I am left with feelings, heavy feelings. It's sometimes exhausting to envision what all those family relations and personalities look and feel like. And though part of me wants to meet some of these DNA relatives, another part of me wonders what the heck we have in common other than DNA. And this knowledge, of course, does nothing to help me with one of my biggest challenges in life, and that is how to trust people. How can I trust people who maybe cheated or lied or cover up or perhaps never personally attended to their own choices and loss and grief and pain, or worse, maybe they had no conscience whatsoever and they didn't care who they affected or abandoned or impregnated. And it's exhausting to think these things for certain, and it's not easy to be uncritical of other human beings. So many of us who have human qualities and human faults. What I do know is that my father was born 4 months after my grandmother and her husband, the man I thought was my grandfather, got married, and that my grandmother and genetic grandfather lived near one another in rural northern Wisconsin before that. I'll likely never know the rest of the story, though the highly improbable fantasy I have is that the man who married my grandmother intentionally chose to marry her, even though she was pregnant with another man's child. I know that sounds delusional, but it's unlikely, yet the other alternatives are painful. It causes me to be critical of my fellow human beings and their motives, and I try not to go there if I don't have to. Back to identity. In terms of identity, I identify as a person in sustained remission from alcohol and nicotine use disorder, or as a person in long-term recovery from alcoholism and smoking, or as a sober alcoholic and an ex-smoker. So I was able to stop consuming alcohol with a lot of help, professional and personal, on August 22nd, 2005. And I stopped smoking on June 19, 2009 with the help of an employer who disallowed smoking on the company's campus, and by the drug Chantix, which almost drive me mad, by the way, because it produced the most bizarre nightmares I've ever had. And word is it might be its own cancer-causing agent. I hope not, but oh well. And those were a lot of things. Yet I can tell you I'm proud of my identity, especially as an active member of the adoption community as well as the recovery community. I've done a significant amount of work personally to investigate some misperceptions that previously informed my life. And that work has started with a 4-step and a 12-step program. It morphed into a memoir, and it continues unfolding even today. And I try to give back by participating in community and writing and speaking and doing interviews. And you can find some of this if you look for David B Bohl online, if you haven't done so already. One thing I want you to realize is that I'll be speaking in September 24 in Orlando, Florida, on the topic of addiction, separation from family, and the path to healing at the in-person International Conference of Secular AA, which is an event that I've been attending since their first event in 2014 back in Santa Monica, California. Personally, I've been married to the same amazing woman for 40 years, which is no small feat for a person who struggles trusting others, and for a person who has certainly adversely affected those close to him by almost destroying himself with alcoholism. I have 2 adult children who are enthusiastically in my life, as are their partners. I'm soon to be a grandfather, which will give me plenty more opportunity to expand my identity, of course, and to reflect. And I currently reside on a lake where I practice blue line, which is where I'm able to reap the mental and physical health benefits from being near, in, or on the water. And there's a book written about this, by the way, by Wallace J. Nichols, or Jay as he's called. He's a fellow adoptee, and he's a resident of the Cali Slow Coast. And I work professionally with individuals and families and organizations to help those with addiction and or separation experiences. So as you can tell, my share today doesn't follow that typical experience, strength, hope format, or rather it does, but just not in that chronology. If you'd like a more traditional version of my story, I will link to it in the YouTube video once that's posted. But wow, right? That's a lot of identity, and it's my identity, and it will be, and it'll be with me every step of the way as I live my life. And now I'm cool with that. I'm good with that. I accept that. But I wasn't always good with that, and I didn't know all that I know today either. But I do know that by discovering and expanding my identity, it's ultimately the succinct version of how I've recovered and healed. I have investigated my identity. I've locked into what's true about it rather than what I might have perceived about it. And I make the best of it, knowing what I know today. So all of this stuff was going on, right? Either in my actual reality or in that parallel universe or the ghost kingdom, which Betty Jean Lifton described in her book, Journey to the Adopted Self. She talks about the ghost kingdom as this psychic reality where what-if projections of lost or wished-for persons reside, and they're often conceptualized as ghosts. And my head was full of them. So it was a really active place. Maybe some of you have had this. Maybe some of you have thought about this just like I have. And if you have, you know how brutal it was, how torturous it was. It was like always feeling different and defective and inadequate growing up, feeling that there was something so obviously wrong with me that I had to keep it hidden from everybody, or that they could already see there was something wrong with me and I needed to be ashamed of it. It was about never truly knowing who I was, lacking a coherent identity, which is why I am so focused on it today. And that was in part because I didn't have any biological markers to draw from because I wasn't around biological relatives. I had no specific information about genetic relatives, but it was because I had no idea how important it was to develop this identity or talk to anybody about it. I realized that I'd been damaged, and I had a non-existent ego. And I suffered from an identity crisis, which is a term coined by kinship adoptee and psychologist Eric Erickson, where I failed to achieve a healthy ego strength and self-identity. I was fraught with distress in relationships with others, including my adopted parents and my family and myself, and of course, the universe at large. And I truly suffered, admittedly. I always felt alone, isolated, and never felt understood or seen. And I thirsted for connection. Thirsted. See what I did there? Well, let's shift a little bit. So what happened? Well, at age 13, a solution magically appeared to deal with all of that misery. I was sitting in the back of the boat on the very lake I live on today with some contemporaries. I was agonizing about feeling uncomfortable, not certain if they wanted me around, not certain if we were friends and what that meant. Somebody handed me a can of Olympia beer. And the first one tasted okay. I'd tasted beer before. My adoptive father had given me sips of his special export beer prior to that, but it was that second 12 ounces that, excuse me, really opened the heavens for me. And guess what? Yeah, I had found connection in that can of beer. I'd found a family to drink that can of beer with. And that alcohol allowed me to feel comfortable, or at least it allowed me to feel less uncomfortable. And my brain took note of that. My brain wired itself to know how to obtain that feeling over and over again from that day forward. And what that alcohol powerfully did was to change my reality, or change my perception of reality. And that allowed me to function. It allowed me to live and to coexist with all those warring emotions I continue to have. And it saved me from myself, my ruptured, judgmental, harshly pervasive sense of self that unconsciously colored my view and the others in it. But of course, as I became psychologically reliant on that alcohol over the years, my body also became physiological dependent upon it. And what was initially a medicine for what ailed me became a toxin that really tried to kill me. And though it took me an inordinately long time to recognize this reality, I finally did. And it was not without some very severe and lasting consequences. Yet I was in such desperate disrepair, to borrow a term from 12-step programs, I was pretty badly mangled, and I needed help to dig out of that mess. So I started with a medical detoxification and a hospital emergency ward. I transferred directly to a residential treatment program. I stepped down to an intensive outpatient program, all the way averaging more than one meeting a day for the first 365 days of my sobriety, because I had to. I didn't know what else to do. And it worked. It stopped me from creating additional problems. It stabilized my life. Yet, even after I stopped drinking, I still felt that there was something wrong with me beyond that. The problems that informed my initiative drinking hadn't gone away, and I had to figure out what those were. So even after being in a program of recovery for a while, I was still in pain. I was still suffering that same anguish I had before, though now I wasn't making it any worse. And the difference was at this point in my life, as it turned out, was that I was clear-minded enough to start to figure out what was creating and influencing those feelings. I was finally able to try to identify the causes and conditions for my pain. And then one day it happened. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, my relinquishment and adoption had something to do with all of this. It hadn't occurred to me as I was going through treatment. It hadn't occurred to me while I was meeting with others with similar stories and challenges and motivations to get healthy. It didn't occur to me after I wrote this searching and fearless inventory narrative that encompassed literally hundreds of handwritten pages and many months of discipline to write something every day. But now it was finally staring me in the face. I had to investigate this. I had to go where I hadn't been able to go before. And the Stoic philosophers are brilliant about this. They say the obstacle is the way. And that's what I had to do. I had to locate that obstacle, and I had to go that way intentionally and definitively. And it was then that I was finally able to address the problems that started all of this in the first place. Those overwhelming feelings of loss and grief that I hadn't known were there all along, that confusion and identity void I experienced, and figuring out how to develop an identity without adapting or isolating. I had to figure out what was going on with this crisis of low self-esteem and self-confidence I'd had all along. And of course, I had to learn how to form healthy attachments. And I got to work. Sadly, there were no books or courses or YouTube videos or recovery programs to show me how to do this. But I was able to figure this out, and you can too if you haven't already. And ultimately, what I have to do is I have to connect with reality. I have to do that meaningfully and repeatedly. To be more accurate, I guess I need to work really hard to gain mastery of my earlier adverse experiences. I have to reframe my perceptions and misperceptions, and I have to replace old coping mechanisms that are now obsolete. Some might call these survival strategies because they help me to be alive today to share with all of you. But I had to find some healthy ones to deal with life's challenges going forward. And what I call this is relentlessly pursuing reality. Relentlessly pursuing reality. It's a daily philosophy of growth and wellness and identity expansion that I need to stay healthy. And I practice this. And through practicing this, I've come full circle, and including some support group meetings in my life. Initially I started going to AA, an alcoholism 12-step meeting. I grew wary of it because the language often felt really heavy and judgmental to me. I couldn't relate to the language. I then transitioned into secular recovery groups. I later found and founded a relinquishment and recovery group, and now I can still find comfort in the groups that I initially went to. And much of this has to do with the fact that I have a much better understanding of what Bill Wilson, one of the co-founders of AA in particular, was up against. Because as it turns out, he was abandoned by his parents. He was relinquished to the care of his grandparents. And all the while, he needed to create his own coping mechanisms for the pain of that betrayal. And it's not a stretch for me to conceive that he found alcohol kind of like I did. He was also able to find some trust and connection with others, even though he was rejected and refused when an adoption agency denied he and his wife Lois a baby because Lois kept having ectopic pregnancies and because Bill was alcoholic. Nope, no baby for you. So he had a lot to overcome. So there's lots of trauma from the beginning in Bill W.'s life, as there was in mine. There's certainly a lot of trauma then that entered those recovery rooms back then that might not have been identified, but it hung heavily over those meetings, certainly. So ultimately, what I do is I find reality by focusing on two things. I work hard to investigate and to experiment and take action so I can better get to know myself, to understand my identity, my true identity. And of course, then I open myself to selected others, like some people I'm talking to today, and asking you to check my experiences and sometimes validate my experiences if they're right, and check my view of reality to make sure I have not gone astray, because I have a history of not seeing reality for what it is. And reality, that which truly exists in the universe and in my life, is what keeps me healthy. There's some concepts that are created with associated with reality that other philosophical programs or daily living programs use. One of them is control. I have to constantly check to see what is in my control and what isn't. And of course, it's the latter, what isn't in my control, that I have the most problem because I try to control that. Another concept of reality is acceptance. I have to identify what really is, what reality is, and accept them as they are, not how I want them to be or wish they could be. And it's about relationality. It's about relationships as connecting and providing protective factors in my life. And as a result of doing this internal work, I can tell you that not only am I more hopeful and fulfilled and connected than I ever have been, but I believe I've also experienced what's called post-traumatic growth, which means I've witnessed positive experiences and outlooks on life that might not have been achieved had that original adversity or stress or developmental interruption or trauma never occurred. And I have. I believe I have gained in identifying the challenges and overcoming them. So relentlessly pursuing a reality has allowed me to achieve and perpetuate an every moment mantra. And my mantra is, in most ways, my life and my internal life are ideal. My life and my internal life are ideal, not without challenges, not without imperfections, but in most ways. And not only do I know that now, but I truly feel that, something I hadn't had most of my life. And I have reality to thank for that. And I have you to thank for that because you're part of my reality. And for that, I'm really grateful. So in the end, recovery for me is about knowing who I am while not having to overly protect my sense of self. Knowing who I am without having to protect that sense of self. And of course, I can't be true to thine own self if I don't know who I am. So I have to continually seek for information and context about who I am. So thank you for listening and for the safety and support of allowing me to share myself with you today.